Ever feel like Washington's just sort of running itself, making big decisions, laws maybe, that never really got debated? You're definitely not imagining it. Today we're doing a deep dive into something pretty fundamental, maybe the biggest constitutional challenge we face right now. This rise of, well, executive governance.
That's right. We're looking at how presidential power seems to inflate almost automatically whenever Congress grinds to a halt. You know, that gridlock we hear so much about.
And suddenly the White House can create major policy just by signing a piece of paper, that famous stroke of the pen.
Yeah, that phrase really hits it, doesn't it? Because it captures this huge shift our sources are tracking. Look, frustration with Congress being stuck, that's real. It's understandable. But the answer can't be the president just stepping outside his constitutional role. The Constitution is really clear. The president's job is to faithfully execute the laws Congress passes.
Not to write them himself.
Exactly, not to write them. But increasingly, that's what we see. The president is becoming the main source for huge new rules, big policy shifts.
And we're not talking small tweaks here. I mean, think about some recent examples that the sources point to. Things like suddenly halting new oil and gas leases on federal land.
Or continuing a nationwide eviction moratorium during a crisis.
Or that vaccine mandate for businesses over 100 employees. These are enormous policy decisions.
Absolutely massive. And they were essentially created by executive fiat, right? Completely bypassing the legislative process, bypassing the representatives you elected.
It really does feel like a constitutional crisis hiding in plain sight.
That's what our sources argue.
Oh.
So our mission today is to really pull back the curtain on this executive governance thing.
Yeah.
We need to trace how legislative power got, well, usurped. Did Congress give it away? Was it taken?
A bit of both, maybe.
Probably. And then we need to look at concrete solutions. What specific reforms do the sources say Congress must put in place to get its authority back? It really is a fight for the separation of powers. To really get how big this problem is, we kind of have to go back to the beginning. The founders, they were pretty explicit. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, it says, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. All of them.
Right. And James Madison, he famously tried to reassure everyone, saying the powers of the new federal government would be few and defined.
That was the promise. Few and defined.
Does anyone actually believe federal power is few and defined today? I mean, seriously.
No, not really. The contrast is just stark. And look at the numbers. The history tells a story. In the first 100 years of the U.S., presidents issued fewer than 800 executive orders. Total.
800 in a century. Okay.
Now, jump forward. Just look at the period from President Truman through President Nixon. Couple of decades, basically.
How many then?
Over 2,200. And more importantly, the sources we looked at highlight that these orders became, quote, increasingly indistinguishable from legislative acts.
So they weren't just managing the executive branch anymore. They were making law.
Effectively, yes. The executive branch sort of normalized making law without Congress. Why? Because it was quicker, easier than trying to push something through the legislative process.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting for me, based on the sources. Because they don't just blame presidents wanting more power, they point a finger straight back at Congress.
You absolutely do. The core argument in the material is that Congress essentially, quote, abdicated its core constitutional responsibility for making the law.
They just stopped doing the hard work.
That's the implication. Presidential overreach, you see, it thrives when there's a vacuum. If Congress doesn't tackle big issues, the president steps in, often claiming the people want action.
And some political figures even bragged about bypassing Congress, didn't they? I think the sources mentioned someone from the Clinton era.
Oh, yeah. Paul Begala. His famous line was, stroke of the pen, law of the land. Kind of cool. He wasn't warning against it. He was celebrating it as a strategy.
Kind of cool if you're in the White House. Maybe less so if you believe in the Constitution.
Precisely. And the sources stress this isn't a partisan thing. It's systemic. Both President George W. Bush and President Obama, they used executive orders to give themselves what the sources call extraordinary powers, especially around terrorism after 9/11.
So it doesn't really matter which party is in charge. The trend is the same. More power flows to the executive.
The trend is definitely towards executive dominance. And that brings us to this parallel threat. Executive orders are one thing, the president acting alone. But the other way legislative power drains away is when Congress itself delegates its lawmaking authority.
Hands it over willingly.
Yes, hands it over to the federal bureaucracy, what people often call the administrative state.
Ah, the alphabet soup agencies.
Exactly. The EPA, the SEC, the FDA, OSH, you name it. And what's wild is Our sources point out there isn't even an official count of all these agencies making rules.
No official count. Seriously.
Estimates suggest maybe 430 or so executive branch agencies are out there making policy that directly impacts your life.
430. Wow, that's a lot of potential regulators.
It's immense. Chief Justice John Roberts had a great line, quoted in the sources, about hundreds of federal agencies poking into every nook and cranny of daily life.
Poking into nooks and crannies and costing a fortune, right?
A massive fortune. This isn't free. This kind of unlegislated lawmaking done by agencies, not Congress, it's like a hidden tax. The Competitive Enterprise Institute, one source, estimates the administrative state costs the economy nearly $2 trillion a year.
$2 trillion annually. From regulations Congress never actually voted on as regulations.
That's their estimate. A staggering cost imposed on everyone, businesses and individuals, without a direct up or down vote from your elected representatives on the rule itself.
Okay, so that's the diagnosis. A massive unelected bureaucracy making rules that cost trillions, basically because Congress said, you guys handle the details.
Or just passed vague laws letting the agencies fill in the blanks.
So if the goal is to, put Congress back in the driver's seat, how do you even start to rein that in? The sources must have some specific ideas.
They do. They focus on mechanisms to restore accountability, get back to constitutional basics. Two big ones stand out.
Let's hear them.
Okay, first is about making rulemaking accountable again. This brings up the REINS Act. That stands for Regulations from the Executive in Need of Scrutiny Act.
REINS Act. Okay, what does it do?
It basically flips the current process on its head. Right now, an agency makes a rule, and it takes effect unless Congress somehow passes a joint resolution to stop it, which is incredibly hard to do.
So the default is the rule happens.
Right. The REINS Act changes the default. It would require Congress to proactively vote to approve any major rule, one with a big economic impact, say $100 million or more, before it can take effect.
So instead of needing a vote to stop a rule, the agency needs a vote to start the rule.
Exactly. The burden shifts. The agency and the White House would have to convince Congress, your representatives, that the rule is a good idea. It puts the lawmaking power and the political heat back on Congress, where the founders put it.
But let's be practical. Could Congress handle that? They seem to struggle passing basic stuff now. Wouldn't this just create more gridlock?
That's a fair question and a common counterargument. But the source material's perspective is, that's Congress's job. If a rule is important enough to have a major impact, Congress should debate it and vote on it.
And if they can't agree,
then maybe the rule doesn't happen, which, from a limited government perspective, might not be a bad outcome. It forces Congress to legislate consciously, not just let agencies run wild.
Okay, that's one big idea, the REINS Act. What's the second mechanism?
The second one tackles the deference courts give to agencies. It involves amending the Administrative Procedure Act, the APA.
The APA, right, that's like the rule book for how agencies operate. Sounds technical.
It is a bit, but it's crucial. Right now, courts often use standards like Chevron deference, which basically means they'll accept an agency's interpretation of a law if it's just reasonable, even if the court thinks there's a better interpretation. It gives agencies huge leeway.
So the courts kind of step back.
They often do. The reform proposed in the sources is to amend the APA to require courts to conduct a more thorough reasonableness review of agency actions, especially the president's regulatory decisions. No more rubber stamping.
Meaning the courts would have to really kick the tires and make sure the agency's decision makes sense and isn't, as the source put it, a flagrant abuse of discretion.
Precisely. It gives the judiciary a stronger tool to check bureaucratic overreach, ensuring agencies stay within the bounds of the law Congress actually wrote.
Okay, so REINS Act for upfront congressional approval and APA reform for better judicial review. That covers the administrative state. What about the president acting alone using emergency powers?
Yes, the emergency powers loophole. This is another huge area the sources flag. When the Constitution was written, the founders were incredibly wary of giving the president unilateral emergency powers.
They just fought a king, right? They didn't want another one.
Exactly. So the Constitution gives the president, quote, practically nothing in the way of emergency authorities. He can command the militia if called forth by Congress, and he can call Congress into session on extraordinary occasions. That's about it.
Very limited.
Intentionally so. They feared a leader declaring some crisis and just grabbing power.
But that seems very different from today. We have laws now that give the president broad emergency powers, don't we?
We certainly do. A key one highlighted is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA. This law lets the president declare a national emergency over basically any unusual and extraordinary threat, which can be almost anything, and unlock this whole toolbox of unilateral powers.
Unusual and extraordinary threat. That sounds incredibly broad, vague even.
It is. And it's become the go-to mechanism, the sources argue, for presidents to get things done when Congress won't cooperate, especially funding for pet projects.
Like the border wall example. That's
Yeah.
mentioned prominently.
Yes, that's a perfect case study according to the sources. President Trump wanted funding for the wall. Congress repeatedly refused to provide the amount he wanted. So he declared a national emergency at the border, invoked IEPA, and redirected military construction funds.
He essentially snatched funding, as the source puts it, that Congress explicitly denied him.
That's the argument. And what's really telling is what happened next. Congress actually tried to stop him. They voted to terminate the emergency declaration.
And the votes were strong, weren't they? Bipartisan majorities in both the House and Senate.
Yes, the House voted 248-181, the Senate 53-36. Clear majorities saying no.
But it didn't matter.
It didn't matter because those majorities weren't big enough.
Yeah.
They weren't the two-thirds needed to override the president's veto, which inevitably came.
So even when Congress actively disagreed, the emergency power held. It shows how tilted the scales are.
Completely. And IEPA isn't some obscure law used once in a blue moon. The statistics cited are pretty stark. Over 90% of presidential emergency declarations in recent decades have been based on IEPA.
90%. Wow.
And here's the kicker. These emergencies can be renewed year after year, basically automatically, unless Congress musters that nearly impossible two-thirds veto-proof majority to repeal them.
So any real reform has to tackle IEPA head-on, otherwise you're leaving this massive presidential tower unchecked.
Absolutely. It's central to the problem of unilateral executive action.
Okay, let's try to bring this all together. We've talked about executive orders becoming like laws, Congress handing off power to hundreds of agencies, and presidents using emergency declarations to bypass the legislature. So what does this all mean for you listening right now? You, the citizen, who feels like Washington is just too big, too distant.
Well, it means the whole way our government is supposed to work has fundamentally shifted. This expansion of executive power, this rise of the administrative state, it's a profound move away from what the founders envisioned, which was a limited government with clearly separated powers.
And when laws are made by decree, by executive order, or by some agency you've never heard of,
It means your life, your business, your well-being feels constantly at risk, as one source puts it, subject to decisions made in ways that aren't transparent or directly accountable to you through elections. And this lack of clear legislative accountability, it fuels the political division and conflict we see everywhere.
because the Constitution was meant to limit power, divide it up, precisely to protect liberty. But if Congress doesn't do its job or gives its power away,
That whole structure starts to break down. It stops feeling like a government by the people and more like government by experts or by whoever happens to hold the presidential pen at the moment.
is there any upside here? Is there a way back?
The sources suggest there is. They argue this very crisis of executive overreach could actually spark a congressional resurgence, a moment where Congress decides to take its power back.
But it won't happen on its own.
No. As Thomas Jefferson warned, and this is a point raised in the material, the natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground. Reversing that takes effort. It takes more than just Congress passing laws like REINS or reforming the APA.
It takes public demand.
It requires public opinion to evolve, as
Right.
one source phrases it. Enough people need to understand what's happened and demand that government, especially the federal government, step back into its constitutional lane.
So the knowledge is now yours. We've laid out the problem based on these sources, the executive orders, the delegation, the emergency powers. We've discussed the potential solutions. The REINS Act, APA reform, tackling IEPA.
The path seems clear, constitutionally speaking.
But the final provocative thought we want to leave you with, drawing from everything we've discussed, is this. Are enough Americans truly aware of how much legislative power has shifted away from their elected representatives? And more importantly, are enough people ready to demand that Congress reclaim that power, limit the administrative state, and confine the executive regardless of party to its constitutional role?
That's the real question. Because ultimately, the future of limited government, the kind the founders envisioned, probably rests on the answer.